The grand hall of the Obsidian Palace was a galaxy of captive stars. 1,000 candles, suspended in globes of spun crystal, dripped light onto the polished marble floor, turning it into a black, bottomless lake reflecting a midnight sky. The air, thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and expensive wine, hummed with the curated murmur of 100 conversations, a delicate symphony of power and intrigue. At the center of this constellation stood King Lucian, a figure carved from shadow and sovereignty. His black silk tunic was threaded with silver that caught the light like trapped lightning, and the crown of jagged obsidian on his brow was less an ornament than a manifestation of his will. He was a portrait of regal patience, one hand resting lightly on the gilded arm of his throne, the other holding a goblet of blood-red wine he had yet to touch. But beneath the placid surface, a cold fury was slowly coming to a boil. He could feel the eyes on him, the sly, assessing glances of the dignitaries from the northern wastes, the anxious flickers from his own council members, the gossiping whispers that hid behind elegantly gloved hands. They were all watching, all waiting. An hour. She was an entire hour late. Mira, his betrothed. The linchpin of an alliance that would secure his eastern border for a century. A political necessity he had accepted with the same detached pragmatism he applied to all matters of state. He had seen her portraits, of course, a pale, serious face framed by dark hair, with eyes that seemed to hold a quiet, reserved intelligence. He had met her twice in formal, chaperoned settings where they exchanged pleasantries as thin and fragile as spun sugar. He knew her to be dutiful, well-bred, and by all accounts, punctual. Her tardiness was not merely an inconvenience, it was a statement, a public, resounding slap to his authority on the very night that authority was meant to be celebrated and solidified. The engagement ball was his design, a spectacle of power intended to awe his rivals and reassure his allies. Her empty place beside his throne was a gaping wound in the tapestry of the evening, a flaw that drew every eye. "Perhaps her carriage was delayed, Your Majesty," whispered his chamberlain, Valerius, his face a mask of strained neutrality. "The roads from the sunken valley are treacherous after the rains." Lucian's jaw tightened. He did not turn his head, his gaze fixed on the great, arched doors through which she was meant to have entered 63 minutes ago. "The rains stopped at dawn, Valerius. And her convoy is escorted by a dozen of my finest guards. Treachery on the roads is the least of my concerns." The implication hung in the air between them, sharp and cold. The treachery he was concerned with was of a more personal, more humiliating nature. He could hear the whispers more clearly now. An hour. Did she refuse him? A bad omen for the union. The king does not look pleased. Each phrase was a small stone striking the immaculate surface of his pride. He had ruled for 2 centuries, his reign marked by ruthless efficiency and unwavering control. He did not tolerate mistakes, he did not suffer insults, and this felt, acutely, like an insult of the highest order. Was this her first play for power in their arrangement? A test of his famous temper? A naive attempt to assert her own importance by making the world wait? He took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine. The metallic tang was usually a comfort, a reminder of his nature, his strength. Tonight, it tasted like ash. The orchestra, sensing the growing tension in the room, faltered for a moment before a sharp glance from the conductor spurred them back into a lively waltz. The music felt like a mockery, a cheerful melody laid over a drumbeat of impending wrath. He decided then what he would do. He would not cause a scene by sending guards to fetch her. That would signal panic, a loss of control. He would wait. He would let her walk into the hall and face the full, silent judgment of his court. And then he would dismantle her defiance with a few, carefully chosen words, sharp and cold enough to strip the leaves from a winter tree. He would remind her, and everyone present, precisely where she stood. Just as the thought solidified, a commotion rippled from the entrance. The great doors swung inward, pushed by 2 liveried attendants. And there, framed in the archway, stood Mira. The hall fell silent. The music died on a single, discordant note. Every head turned. Lucian's eyes narrowed, his anger sharpening to a fine, cruel point. She was a mess. Not overtly, not to an undiscerning eye, but to his predatory senses the details were stark. Her gown of deep sapphire silk, while exquisite, seemed to hang on her frame a little unevenly. A few stray tendrils of her dark hair had escaped their intricate coiling, clinging to her temples. But it was her face that held him. She was pale, so pale she seemed almost translucent under the candlelight, her pallor throwing the deep violet smudges under her eyes into stark relief. She looked less like a radiant bride-to-be and more like a ghost haunting her own celebration. She took a hesitant step forward, her gaze sweeping the silent, staring crowd before finally landing on him. He saw a flicker of something in their depths, not defiance, but something he couldn't immediately name. Fear, perhaps. Exhaustion. But he was in no mood for nuance. He saw only the culmination of his public humiliation. He rose from his throne, the motion fluid and menacing. The silence in the hall deepened, becoming heavy, suffocating. He descended the 2 steps from the dais, his boots making no sound on the marble, and moved toward her. He did not hurry. He let the space between them stretch, let the anticipation build. He wanted her to feel the weight of every eye, the pressure of his displeasure. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked down, his height a clear advantage, and let the coldness of his rage settle into his features. "You are late," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried through the cavernous hall as if he had shouted. It was a low, resonant sound laced with ice. Mira flinched, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through her body. She curtsied, her movements stiff. "Your Majesty, I apologize. There were unforeseen circumstances." Her voice was a whisper, thin and reedy, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Lucian's lips curled into a semblance of a smile that held no warmth, no forgiveness. It was a predator's smile. "Unforeseen circumstances," he repeated, savoring the words, turning them into an accusation. "An entire hour of them. You have kept not only me, but our honored guests waiting. You have made the crown of 1,000 years wait upon your convenience." He took another step closer, forcing her to tilt her head back to look at him. He lowered his voice further, making it a private cruelty in a public space. "Is this how you mean to begin our union? With a display of such profound disrespect? Or was this merely carelessness, a woman's flighty inattention to the passage of time?" He saw the hurt flash in her eyes, raw and immediate, before she quickly veiled it. A faint flush of color rose in her pale cheeks, born of shame, not defiance. "No, my king," she murmured, her gaze dropping to the floor between them. "It was not my intention. I am deeply sorry for the embarrassment I have caused you." Her apology was quiet, correct. It should have placated him, but it only stoked the fire of his anger. Her meekness felt like another strategy, another way to rob him of a satisfying confrontation. He wanted a fight, a reason to unleash the pressure building inside him. Her quiet defense gave him nothing to push against. "Sorrow does not turn back the clock," he said, his voice hard as diamond. "It does not erase the insult. Your duty tonight was simple, to be here, on time. You failed. See that it does not happen again." He turned his back on her then, a gesture of dismissal more profound than any further words. He strode back to his throne, the silence of the court breaking behind him into a flurry of renewed, feverish whispers. He motioned to the conductor. "Music." The orchestra stumbled back to life. Lucian sat, picked up his untouched goblet, and drained it in one long, cold swallow. He did not look at Mira, did not watch as she was led to the smaller consort's chair beside his own. He could feel her presence, though, a small, cold knot of misery in the grand warmth of the hall. He had done what he intended. He had reasserted his dominance. He had put her firmly in her place. But the victory felt hollow, and the cold fury within him did not abate. It simply settled, deeper and heavier, into a state of grim, irritable dissatisfaction. The night was young, and her penance, he decided, was only just beginning. The first dance was, by tradition, for the engaged couple. When the waltz began, its melody sweeping and grand, Lucien rose and turned to Mira. He did not offer his hand. He simply waited, his expression imperious. For a moment she hesitated, her pale face frozen. Then, with a visible effort, she stood and placed her gloved fingers into his outstretched palm. Her hand was cold, unnaturally so, even for one of their kind. Her touch was feather-light, almost tentative, as if she feared he might shatter. He led her to the center of the floor. The courtiers cleared a wide circle, their faces a mixture of avid curiosity and feigned nonchalance. He placed a hand on her waist, feeling the rigid tension in her spine, and pulled her into the formal steps of the dance. They moved together, a perfect picture of royal unity for the watching eyes. But the space between them was a frozen chasm. He was a flawless dancer, leading her through the intricate turns with practiced ease. But she was clumsy. Her steps were stiff, her responses a fraction of a second too slow. More than once, he had to physically guide her, his grip tightening on her waist to keep her from faltering. It annoyed him further. Was every aspect of her being tonight designed to be an irritant? "You seem distracted," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear as he spun her in a graceful arc. "I am merely overwhelmed, Your Majesty," she replied, her voice tight with strain. She did not meet his eyes, her gaze fixed somewhere over his shoulder. "It is a grand occasion." He noticed then a small repetitive gesture she made. Every few steps, her left hand, the one resting on his shoulder, would subtly adjust the long satin glove on her right arm, pulling it higher, smoothing the fabric over her forearm. It was a nervous, fidgety motion that spoke of discomfort. He saw her wince, a fleeting, sharp intake of breath, as he guided her through a particularly swift turn. He tightened his hold, a silent warning to keep up, and felt her whole body tense in response. He misread every signal. He saw her stiffness as resentment, her fumbling steps as passive aggression, her pained expressions as petulant theatrics. His anger, which had been a sharp, clean blade, was now curdling into a sour, contemptuous irritation. He had bound himself to a woman who was not only disrespectful, but also, it seemed, graceless and sullen. The century of peace she represented suddenly felt like a very long prison sentence. They danced in silence, the only sound the sweep of their feet on the marble and the soaring notes of the violins. He was intensely aware of her, the faint, almost undetectable scent of something metallic and antiseptic clinging to her skin beneath her floral perfume, the shallow, controlled nature of her breathing, the rigid set of her jaw. He could feel a tremor running through her, a fine, high-strung vibration of a body pushed past its limits. Yet he saw it all through the red-tinged lens of his own wounded pride. The waltz reached its crescendo, the music swelling to a dramatic final chord. He spun her one last time, a flourish for the audience, and as he did, her balance finally gave way. She stumbled, a cry of pain escaping her lips, her body lurching sideways. Instinct, honed over centuries of battle and command, took over. His arm shot out, his hand clamping around her upper arm to steady her before she could fall. He caught her, pulling her upright against him. The motion was abrupt, forceful. Her sleeve, made of heavy sapphire silk, was pulled taut by his grip, and then, with the momentum of her near fall, it rode up past her elbow. And he saw it. The world seemed to slow, the music and the whispers of the court fading into a dull, distant roar. His entire focus narrowed to the horrifying sight on her arm. Her long, elegant white glove was not white anymore. A dark crimson stain had bloomed from beneath, soaking the delicate satin in a ragged, ugly pattern. Above the glove, where the sleeve had slipped away, he saw it, a thick, hastily wrapped bandage, itself completely saturated with blood. Fresh blood. So much of it that it had seeped through the thick padding to stain her skin and the fabric of her glove. For a heartbeat, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. The image was so incongruous, so violent, in the glittering, civilized perfection of the ballroom. Blood and bandages. Wounds hidden beneath silk and satin. He looked from her arm to her face. Her eyes were wide, panicked, and filled with a brilliant, unshed sheen of tears. Her face, already pale, had gone ashen. She tried to pull her arm away, to hide the evidence, but his grip was like iron. "What?" he breathed, the single word a rasp of disbelief and dawning horror. The fury that had animated him all evening vanished, instantly replaced by a cold, sickening dread. "What is this?" The court was a blur of colors and faces at the edge of his vision. He was only dimly aware of the collective gasp that rippled through the onlookers. All he could see was the blood, her blood, and the stark, unadulterated pain that was finally, terrifyingly visible in her eyes. He didn't wait for an answer. Not there. Not in the center of 100 gaping faces. He slid his arm from her waist to her back, sweeping her into his arms. She was shockingly light. He lifted her as if she were made of glass and, turning his back on his stunned court, strode from the ballroom floor. He moved with a speed that blurred the edges of the world. The shocked faces of his guests, the ornate tapestries on the walls, the concerned call of Valerius from behind him. It was all just noise. He carried her through a side door into a small, private antechamber furnished with velvet couches and a cold, unlit hearth. The air was still and silent. He kicked the door shut behind him, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He gently set her down on one of the couches, his movements now stripped of all anger, replaced with a frantic, unfamiliar tenderness. He knelt before her, his gaze locked on her injured arm, which she now cradled protectively against her chest. "Mira," he said, and her name was a raw, broken thing in his throat. "Tell me what happened." She wouldn't look at him. She stared down at her lap, her whole body trembling violently now that the adrenaline of the public performance had faded. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "It is nothing, Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice choked. "A minor accident." "Do not lie to me," he commanded, but the harshness was gone, replaced by a desperate urgency. He reached out, his hand hovering over her arm, afraid to touch, afraid of the damage he might do. "This is not a minor accident. I've seen battle wounds less severe than this looks. Who did this to you?" The dam of her composure, already cracked and strained, finally broke. A sob tore from her, a sound of such profound pain and exhaustion that it struck him like a physical blow. The story came pouring out of her in a torrent of gasps and broken sentences, the words tumbling over each other in their haste to be free. "On the road, from the valley, an ambush." She drew a ragged breath. "Not bandits, rogues. 3 of them. They overwhelmed the guards quickly." Her eyes, when she finally lifted them to his, were haunted. They wanted to make a statement, to kill the king's betrothed on the way to her own celebration. Lucian felt the blood freeze in his veins. Rogues. Feral, blood-crazed outcasts. A death sentence for most. "I fought them," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength from the memory. "My escort. They fought bravely. They fell." She choked on the words. "I was alone. The carriage was overturned. I I killed one of them, with a silver letter opener from my travel case. The other two, they fled when they heard the horns of the patrol you sent to find me." He stared at her, his mind reeling. He pictured the scene, the overturned carriage, the bodies of his guards, and this small, slender woman, fighting for her life in the dark woods with nothing but a desk toy. "Your arm," he prompted gently, his voice thick with a horror he couldn't contain. "One of them had a blade. Cursed iron. It caught me during the fight." She gestured weakly with her good hand. "I used linens from my baggage to bind it. I knew I was late. I knew you would be waiting, that everyone would be watching." Her gaze dropped again, and the fire in her voice died, replaced by that same hollow shame he had seen earlier. "I didn't want to cause a scandal, to appear weak, or to disappoint you. So I told the patrol I had merely been delayed. I had them help me right the carriage, and I came. I thought I could manage the pain until the ball was over." Each word was a nail driving into the coffin of his pride. Each sentence a testament to his own monumental, unforgivable blindness. He had stood on his dais, wrapped in his arrogant fury, judging her for a crime of disrespect, while she had been fighting for her very life. She had battled vampires, bandaged her own grievous wounds, and dragged herself to his palace, all to honor an arrangement he had treated with cold disdain. And what had he done? He had met her incredible, silent courage with public humiliation. He had taken her pain and her resilience and twisted them into carelessness and insubordination. He had berated her for being a mess when she was, in fact, a miracle of survival. The cold dread in his stomach churned, transmuting into a wave of self-loathing so powerful it threatened to suffocate him. He looked at the blood on her glove, the tear tracks on her pale cheeks, the tremor in her hands, and he saw the full, devastating scope of his cruelty. The king who saw everything had seen nothing at all. "Healers!" he roared, the sound ripping from his chest, a desperate, primal cry. He didn't wait for the door to open. He surged to his feet, tore it open himself, and bellowed into the hallway, where Valerius and 2 guards stood, frozen in alarm. "Get my personal healers, now! And bring the finest medical supplies in the palace!" He turned back to her, his movements frantic. He knelt before her again, his mind racing. He couldn't wait for the healers. Cursed iron. The wound would be festering, poisoning her. "Mira, let me see," he said, his voice now a plea. He reached for her arm, his hands trembling. This time, she didn't resist. She watched him with wide, exhausted eyes as he began the delicate, terrible task of unwrapping the layers of her disguise. His fingers, usually so steady whether signing a death warrant or adjusting a crown, fumbled with the tiny pearl buttons of her glove. He slid the blood-soaked satin from her hand, revealing fingers stained with dried blood and grime. Then, he gently began to unwrap the makeshift bandage. The first layer of linen was stiff, caked with blood. Beneath it, another, and another. She had used nearly an entire bolt, packing it tightly to staunch the bleeding. With each layer he removed, the coppery scent of blood grew stronger, filling the small room. He finally reached the last layer. He peeled it back, his breath catching in his throat at the sight of the wound itself. It was a long, vicious gash, running from her wrist halfway up her forearm. The edges were jagged, angry red, and already showing the telltale black tracery of a cursed weapon's poison. It was deep, a wound that should have had her screaming in agony, not waltzing in a silent torment. "Gods," he whispered, the word a prayer and a curse. He looked up at her face. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. She hadn't cried out, hadn't even flinched as he exposed the injury. Her stillness was more damning than any scream could have been. He felt a rage unlike any he had ever known. Not the cold, proud anger of before, but a hot, white fury directed entirely at himself. He was the king. His roads, his lands, his protection. She was his betrothed, under his care. And he had failed her in every conceivable way. He had failed to protect her, failed to see her pain, and when she had overcome it all to stand before him, he had punished her for it. The healers burst into the room, their arms laden with salves, clean bandages, and instruments. They stopped short at the sight of the king kneeling on the floor, his hands covered in his betrothed's blood. "Get out," Lucian snarled, his voice low and dangerous as he looked over his shoulder. "Leave the supplies." The head healer, a vampire ancient enough to have served Lucian's father, blinked in confusion. "Your Majesty, a cursed wound requires—" "I am aware of what it requires," Lucian cut him off, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I will tend to it myself. Leave. Now." The healers exchanged a frightened glance, deposited their supplies on a nearby table, and backed out of the room, closing the door softly behind them. Lucian turned back to Mira. He needed to do this. This was his failing, his wound to mend. It was a penance, a desperate act of atonement that felt pitifully small in the face of his transgression. He worked with a surgeon's focus, his earlier frantic energy settling into a deep, consuming concentration. He cleaned the wound with an alcohol-laced solution, his touch so gentle it was barely there. Mira hissed in pain as the liquid fire met her raw flesh, the first sound of her own suffering she had allowed herself to make. The sound lanced through him, a physical manifestation of his guilt. "I am sorry," he murmured, his voice thick. "I am so sorry." He applied a thick, dark salve, one made from silver dust and powdered moon petal, the only known antidote to the poison of cursed iron. He then wrapped her arm in clean, soft bandages, his movements sure and practiced. He had dressed 1,000 wounds on 100 battlefields, but none had ever mattered as much as this. As he worked, he could feel her eyes on him, studying him with a quiet intensity. When he was finished, he tied off the final bandage and gently lowered her arm to rest on a velvet cushion. His hands were stained with her blood. He looked from his hands to her face, and the dam of his own control finally broke. "Mira," he began, his voice cracking. He knelt before her, no longer a king, no longer a figure of power, but a man utterly undone. He lowered his head until his forehead rested on her knee, a posture of complete and total surrender. "Forgive me." The words were inadequate. They were pebbles thrown into an ocean of his regret. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I saw only my own pride. I did not see you. I did not see your strength, your courage. I saw nothing." A shudder ran through his powerful frame. "The things I said to you, in front of everyone, there is no excuse, no apology that can erase them. I wounded you more deeply with my words than any blade ever could." He waited for her condemnation, her anger, her disgust. He deserved it. He craved it, even. He needed her to punish him, to give voice to the vile judgment he was passing on himself. Instead, after a long, silent moment, he felt a hand on his head, her uninjured hand. Her fingers were hesitant at first, then they gently, carefully threaded into his hair. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, not yet. It was something more fragile, more profound. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of seeing him in his broken state, just as he had so spectacularly failed to see her. "Look at me, Lucian," she whispered. Her use of his name, without title or formality, was a shock that went straight through him. Slowly, he raised his head. Her face was still pale, still etched with pain and exhaustion, but the fear in her eyes was gone. In its place was a deep, soul-weary sadness, and something else, a flicker of understanding. "You are a king," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "You are accustomed to obedience, to perfection. You saw a flaw in your grand design, and you moved to correct it. I understand pride." This was not pride, he argued, his voice raw. This was cruelty. It was blindness. "I did not even ask. I did not once think to ask if you were all right. I simply assumed the worst of you." He reached up and took her hand, the one in his hair, and held it between his own bloody ones. "I promise you, Mira, I swear on my life, on my crown, on everything I am, I will never again look at you and fail to see you. I will listen. I will always, always listen first." It was more than an apology. It was a vow. A complete reordering of his world, of his very way of being. In that moment, the political alliance, the centuries of tradition, the expectations of his court, they all melted away, leaving only the two of them in the silent room. He was not a king, and she a consort. They were a man and a woman, brought to the brink by violence and pride, and now, perhaps, finding a different kind of beginning in the wreckage. She studied his face, her gaze searching his. He let her see everything, the shame, the regret, the desperate sincerity of his oath. He hid nothing. After a long moment, she gave a slow, solemn nod. A single tear escaped her and traced a path down her cheek, but this one was not for pain or humiliation. It was for something new, something fragile and uncertain that was beginning to bloom in the space between them. He knew what he had to do next. A private apology was not enough. The wound he had inflicted was public, and so the healing must be as well. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "Come," he said, his voice soft but firm. "There is one more thing I must do." She looked at him, a question in her eyes, but she did not resist as he led her from the antechamber. He kept her good hand in his grip a silent promise of support. He pushed open the doors and led her back into the grand hall. The music faltered and died once more as they entered. The courtiers, who had been gathered in anxious, whispering knots, fell silent. Every eye swung to them, to the king and his betrothed, her arm now conspicuously wrapped in clean, white bandages. Lucien did not lead her to the throne. He led her to the center of the room, to the very spot where he had shamed her. He turned to face the assembly, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces, the foreign dignitaries, his council, his subjects. He stood tall, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a somber humility. Mira stood beside him, her presence a quiet testament to the truth he was about to reveal. "An hour ago," he began, his voice clear and strong, resonating through the hall, "I stood in this spot, and I publicly rebuked my betrothed, Lady Mira, for her tardiness. I accused her of disrespect, of carelessness. I did this to defend my own pride." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Kings did not admit fault. They did not confess to pride. Lucien raised a hand, and the hall fell silent again. "I was wrong," he said, the words stark and unequivocal. "I spoke without knowledge. I judged without seeing. The truth is, Lady Mira was not late due to any fault of her own. On her journey here tonight, her convoy was ambushed by rogue vampires." A collective gasp, louder this time, filled the hall. Horror and disbelief were plain on every face. "Her royal guard was slain," Lucien continued, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Alone, she fought off her attackers. She sustained this injury." He gently lifted her bandaged arm for all to see, defending her own life. "And after all that, after facing death in the dark, she did not retreat. She did not send for aid and take to her bed, as anyone would have been right to do. No, she bound her own wounds and she came here. She walked into this hall, bleeding and in pain, to honor her commitment to me, to this court, to this kingdom. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He looked at Mira, his eyes filled with an awe and reverence that was plain for all to see. She endured my coldness. She endured my public scorn. And she did it all in silence, never once speaking of her own heroism, because she did not want to cause a scene or disrupt this celebration. She possesses a courage and a sense of duty that I have rarely seen. The shame tonight is not hers. It is mine. I failed to protect her on the road, and I failed to recognize the hero who stood before me. He then turned fully to Mira, taking her uninjured hand in both of his and bowing his head over it. Lady Mira, before this entire court, I denounce my own cruelty. I beg your forgiveness. And I declare that this kingdom is more fortunate to have you than it could possibly know. You are not just my betrothed. You are a warrior, and you are this kingdom's future queen. He straightened up and met her gaze. He saw shock, disbelief, and then, slowly, a dawning light in her eyes. It was the light of being truly, completely seen. A small, tentative smile touched her lips, a fragile thing of exquisite beauty. In that moment, surrounded by the silent, stunned witnesses of his court, Lucian felt the last vestiges of the cold, pragmatic arrangement between them shatter. It was not a political alliance he wanted with this woman, it was everything. The silence held for another beat, and then, it was one of the northern dignitaries, a stern, bearded man known for his harsh pragmatism, who began to applaud. The sound was stark at first, then it was joined by another, and another, until the entire hall erupted in a thunderous ovation. It was not applause for their king's power, but for his humility. It was for her, for Mira, for the quiet strength that had been brought into the light. Lucian kept his eyes on her, oblivious to the noise around them. He saw the faint color return to her cheeks, a healthy flush this time, not one of shame. He saw the tension in her shoulders finally begin to ease. He had broken something between them earlier, but here, in the rubble, they were building something new, something stronger. Something forged not in duty, but in the devastating, clarifying light of truth. Later, when the ball had finally, mercifully ended, and the last of the guests had departed, leaving behind the scent of wilted flowers and burnt-out candles, they found themselves alone in the quiet stillness of the grand hall. The army of servants had not yet descended to clear away the remnants of the night. It was a landscape of beautiful debris, mirroring the state of their own relationship. Mira was seated on the steps of the dais, her bandaged arm resting in her lap. Lucian sat beside her, not on the throne above, but next to her, on her level. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer oppressive or angry. It was soft, contemplative, a space for healing. "They will talk," Mira said finally, her voice barely a whisper in the vast, empty room. "About what happened, about you." "Let them talk," Lucian replied, his gaze on the reflection of the few remaining candles in the marble floor. "Let them say the king is a fool who was humbled by a woman's courage. It is the truth. And perhaps they will learn what I learned tonight, that true strength is not the absence of weakness, but the willingness to admit it." He turned to look at her. The moonlight, streaming through the high-arched windows, cast her in a soft, silver light. He could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face, but there was a new peace there too, a quiet confidence. "The pain," he asked softly, "is it bad?" She managed a small, wry smile. "It is a dull roar instead of a sharp scream. Your healers are very good. Or perhaps," she added, her eyes meeting his, "the physician himself is." A warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. It was a gentle, burgeoning joy. I owed you that much, and 1,000 times more. I will spend the rest of my life trying to repay the debt I incurred. Tonight. There is no debt, Lucien, she said, and the sound of his name on her lips was a balm. You made a mistake, and then you remade it. That is more than most are willing to do. He reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of the clean white bandage on her arm. The rogues will be hunted. I will find who sent them. I will burn their houses to the ground and salt the earth where they stood. You will be safe. I swear it. I know, she said simply. Her trust in him, offered so freely after he had proven so unworthy of it, was a gift that humbled him all over again. He thought of the future. Before tonight, it had been a series of political maneuvers, alliances, and duties, a map he had already charted. Now the map was gone. In its place was an unknown country, a landscape he would navigate not with a king's edicts, but with a partner's questions. Are you all right? What do you need? Tell me what you are thinking. The foundation of their union was no longer a treaty signed in ink. It was a vow whispered in a quiet room, sealed in blood and regret and a nascent, terrifying hope. It was a promise to listen before judging, to see before assuming, to value the person beside him more than the pride within him. He took her good hand, his touch infinitely gentle, and raised it to his lips. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a pledge of fealty far more real than any coronation oath. Rest, Mira, he said softly. Tomorrow we will begin. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture that meant more than any formal acceptance. The weight of it was grounding, real. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky, chasing away the long, dark night. In the silent, star-dusted hall, surrounded by the ghosts of a disastrous celebration, a king and his future queen sat together, not as rulers, but as survivors, and quietly, carefully, began to fall in love.